Thank you, Dr. Belka and the Honors College for inviting me to be here. It's really great to be here. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about my textbook, which we're really proud of, Governing Texas. It's the best-selling textbook in Texas government. What a lot of people don't realize, and all of you probably do, because many of you students here are taking 2305 and 2306, which are required, right? And here in Texas, the American government and Texas government is required of every student at a public university. And most of the public universities in Texas do 1 semester of American and 1 semester of Texas. Here in the political science department at UH, for many years, we've been doing kind of a hybrid approach where we have a political institutions 1 semester, and that includes Texas and American. And then the other semester, we do sort of more political behavior, public opinion, and the Texas Constitution. And so we do a little differently. But nevertheless, one of the reasons I got started doing this is several years ago, we're already on the 7th edition. Several years ago, when the state moved to having Texas government as sort of a whole separate class, there was a need to have sort of a comprehensive textbook on all the things that cover Texas government. And so Tony Champagne, who's my co-author at UT Dallas, and Ted Harfum. Tony's already retired, so he's no longer actually updating the book. We're currently updating the book we start really, really in advance, but we'll have an updated edition ready to go after the elections. So in November, of course, they're the midterm elections, and so we'll have a new updated edition in January, right, just after the election. So like the day after the election, they're updating this textbook, so it's lots of fun. But the other person on the book, and she unfortunately couldn't be here today. I know she's listed on the program, Professor Jennifer Clark, who's my colleague here in the Department of Political Science at U of H. So Ted Harfum is retiring, so it's just me and Jennifer right now who are going to do all the updates for the book. So let me just talk a little bit about the political culture, people, and economy of the state. And this is mainly coming from the first chapter of this book, which we really don't assign too much at U of H because we want to get into the actual Constitution and the history much quicker. And so one of the things that there we go. One of the things we do with the textbook is we always start out the chapter with, and we change this pretty much every edition, with kind of an introductory story that tries to give you sort of a hook as to why we should care about whatever the topic of that chapter is. And so we always call this like why Texas government matters. And one of the things we're trying to do in the textbook is to try to let students know, because many students taking this course, they're not political science majors, right? They may be a chemistry major or physics major, and many are just checking the box, right? I have to take this course. So how do we make this course sort of relevant, right? How do we make it interesting? And one of the things we're constantly telling them, and this is so important, is that things that affect students in everyday life, things that affect you like the quality of roads, the electric grid, public education, right? A lot of these issues are dealt with by the state government, right? And so that's why it's so important. It touches pretty much every aspect of your life. So we try to impress this upon our students with hopefully engaging stories at the beginning of each chapter, and of course throughout the text as well. Because as we know, right, and we see this with federalism in our country, that we're seeing more and more activity happening at the state level, right? And we start this particular chapter with Operation Lone Star, which is back from 2023, but it's still sort of in effect when we talk about immigration policy and how sort of the lack of any kind of federal immigration policy reform at the federal level has led sort of to what we call a policy vacuum. And so that vacuum is being filled up, right, by the states. In particular, we see this in Texas. We see this in all kinds of other states where the state is doing things about immigration, where in the past it was just the federal government doing things about immigration. And so what we're seeing, and we talk about this in the federalism chapter of this book, is what we call this concept of fractious federalism, right? Federalism, as you all know, have taken the course, right, is this division of power between the federal government and the states. And what we've seen is just more tension between states and the federal government. And so during the Biden administration, of course, there was tension between the state of Texas and the Biden administration, so there was lots of lawsuits that were being filed. You know, the current governor, Abbott, when he was Attorney General, said his job was basically waking up every morning and suing the federal government, right, during the Obama administration. And then, of course, we also see it in reverse when you have a Republican administration. California is suing the Trump administration constantly. And so that's what I mean by this sort of fractious federalism, as opposed to more cooperative federalism. And so what we do in the book is we start out with kind of giving this sort of physical regions of Texas where you can actually see sort of how Texas is such a large state, right? And you have all these different regions that are very different, right? And you know, El Paso, of course, being sort of closer to San Diego than Houston, right? And so you have such a big state. And what we try to do, and I won't go through this in super detail, but what we try to do is just talk a little bit about the different parts of the state and how when we talk about Texas politics, we're talking about a state that has to sort of encompass the views of people living in Houston, which is a very cosmopolitan city, right, with people, you know, from all kinds of walks of life and backgrounds, to places like the interior lowlands, right, where it's a very agricultural and rural economy, where you go there, and of course the values of people living in the rural area is very different than in the big cities. And so it's important to keep that in mind when we're studying Texas politics, that often, I live in Houston, of course my co-authors lived in Dallas, but we're very, very cognizant of sort of the rural experience. And often what we do is we travel around the state to talk to students at different community colleges. And one of the things I've enjoyed doing is sort of learning a lot about people who live in those communities and how we should be attentive to those differences, right? That living in Houston is very different than living in Waco or Abilene or whatever, right? And so one of the other things that we talk about is how power has shifted. You know, politicians from the Great Plains were very active in Texas government in the past. But that power has been ebbing when we see more of an expanding population in the urban areas, right? And that's all part of the urbanization of the state. And we see this just, of course, in the United States in general. More and more people moving to cities or suburbs, or what we call exurbs. And we try to talk about this throughout the book as well. And of course, the Valley has been getting a lot of attention in recent elections, and we've been talking about this, what we call the Valley, the Rio Grande Valley, in which you do have a large Hispanic, Latino population. And in the past have been very democratic in terms of partisanship, like El Paso, McAllen, and Brownsville. But in recent elections, there's been some shifts, and of course, I've written another book looking at these shifts in voting patterns among Latinos to the Republicans, and in particular, my latest book, not the textbook, but another book that I've written. I write a lot of books, I guess, but looks at that shift, right? You can see why that shift has happened. But I think one of the things that it's important when we're talking about politics is to consider politics as affected by economics, and so this sort of interrelationship between economics and politics is very important. And in the state, in a Texas history class, we'll go into more detail about the history here, but we sort of look at those different waves of, the production of cotton and cattle as sort of Texas being a southern state. But then, of course, the oil industry and how that's so important, especially for people who live in the Houston area, and how in the past, Houston has been a city where the oil industry has been very important. It still is, right? Many of your family members probably are employed by, in some relationship to the oil and gas industry. And in the 80s, of course, any kind of downturn in the oil and gas industry had a huge effect on the city economy, right? But more recently, we've seen, like especially in Houston, where the city economy has diversified, and so any kind of shocks to the oil market have been sort of not as catastrophic given the other industries that are here. But of course, now more recently is the high-tech digital economy. We see this with a lot of tech companies moving, especially to the Austin area, Tesla and other, SpaceX and whatnot. Of course, Texas has this sort of history of cattle, right, the history of ranching. And, Texas being one of the nation's biggest cattle suppliers is a very important part of the state economy. But the number of people making a living from agriculture has dropped significantly. So agribusiness has kind of pushed out the family farm and ranch. That's not unique to Texas, obviously, but it's something that that's happening here as well. But I mean, if you look at oil production, that's certainly been the sort of large part of the Texas economy. And when oil prices, of course, are low, that's not a great thing for the city and the state. But nevertheless, if you look back since 2018, there's been a sort of steadiness in terms of oil production, whereas the closing price for a barrel of oil, of course, can make a big difference in the city, especially its employment patterns. But to say a little bit about high tech, because that's something that a lot of you are sort of thinking about or involved in. And one of the things we're working on for the new edition is, how AI affects all this, right? We're all trying to figure out sort of how AI will affect all of our lives, right? And in particular, we want to think a little bit more about that in future editions. But when it comes to high tech, of course, Houston, Dallas, the San Antonio areas are all major hubs, right? And we see this and how this can affect sort of politics as well. Here in Houston, of course, the medical center being very important. The Houston Methodist Hospital and other hospitals. MD Anderson, of course, there's a library named after MD Anderson. And so, again, this is an important part of our city economy, but of course our state economy as well. One of the things that we also talk about is the importance of military bases. And so this map shows you just all the military bases in the state, and in particular how those military bases are important sort of places where people's jobs are affected. San Antonio has quite a few, Lackland Air Force Base being the most popular one there, and of course Fort Bliss as well. But I think one of the things about Texas is our sort of very dynamic population. And so I'm going to say a few words about demography. And what we've seen in Texas, this chart rather shows you from 1850 to more recently sort of the demographics of the state. And I think it's important because here in Texas, of course, our state is much more diverse, right, than a lot of other states. If you look at the Hispanic or Latino population, you see there it starts around 1970 because really that data wasn't collected prior to 1970. The census didn't really ask people their, whether they were Hispanic or Latino or whatever. But what we've seen is that now the Latino population is about 40%, and the non-Hispanic white population about 40%, and then Asian American and African American rounding out the rest. And so I think to understand Texas politics, it's important to understand these different demographic communities. And here in Texas, of course, there's a very large, long-standing Latino population of Texans of Mexican descent or Tejanos. Until 1900, Latinos were concentrated in the south part of Texas. But now, of course, that population is all over the state. Whereas now it's actually higher than 19%. Of Latinos in the U.S. are of Hispanic or Latino background. It's about 25% actually since 2021. But one of the things I've done in my other research is just track sort of the number of Latinos in public office and how that's risen substantially. And you see that in terms of state legislative seats, but also congressional seats. And so I think one of the things that we look at when we talk about representation is we talk about representation, or what we call descriptive representation. That is the extent to which people are represented in Congress or in city councils or state legislatures. And of course, Texas politics, if you look at the past, there of course have been past voting barriers, in particular for minority groups, like the all-white primary, which was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1944. But in the past, of course, Texas was a very democratic state, and it's kind of hard to believe today because it's a very Republican state today. But that's changed, and we track that in our political parties chapter here in particular, and how that changed and how that had an effect on politics in the state. All right, and of course the poll tax, which you read about in American history as well. In Texas, there was a poll tax as well. So the idea of having to pay a tax in order to vote. And of course, we take that for granted today because all we have to do is register to vote, and you don't have to pay a tax, right? And incidentally, early voting is going on, so that's something that I always encourage students to early vote. Vote in the primaries, because right now there's the primary, and here in Texas, You choose which primary you want to vote in. So there's a Democratic and Republican primary, and you just go and say which one you want to vote in, and you can vote in that. And so it's super important because those primaries will determine who the candidates will be in the general election in November. And so generally turnout is lower for the primaries, but really that's where a lot of the election happens. Who the candidates are is super important. So if you haven't done so, you should definitely early vote. One of the things that we would look at is we all like to show a lot of maps and data. Our book has so many different maps, charts, data, because sort of we're all political scientists and we love numbers and we love data, and so we like to show maps and data because it's very important, I think, to learn visually, right? I'm kind of running low on time, but what we do is we go through each of the groups. We look at the history of African Americans in the state. We look at the history of Asian Americans, which is a more recent group. And then we kind of conclude with talking a little bit in this chapter about urbanization and how urbanization has really changed the makeup of the state. We've become a much more urban state than we used to be. And then not only that, but suburbanization. We talk a lot about that as well. The growth of the suburbs and how that affects politics as well. And so I have a lot of slides, but I'm going to kind of, and I go through each of the cities, but I want to conclude because I want to respect everyone's time by just concluding with the political culture and talking a little bit about the future of Texas, that our economy and our people have become very diversified. When we talk about a diversified economy, here in Houston, it's not just oil anymore, right? We have a very diverse economy, but also in the state, right? It's a very diverse economy. It's not sort of just an agricultural economy anymore. And if we think about over the next 30 years, both political parties will have to adjust their expectations and ideologies to meet the demands of an electorate that's going to be changing, right? And I think it's important as well because one of the things that we have to realize is that politics is never static, right? It's very dynamic. And so the way people behave politically today is not necessarily how they'll behave tomorrow, right? And I think there's been a lack of understanding of that when we look at politics in the state, that there is a sense in which people think that the way that people vote today will be the way they vote tomorrow. And we know that that's not true, right? Because it all depends on what's happening in electoral politics. And so with that, I'll stop, and I'm happy to take any questions. And in particular, if you want to ask me questions about sort of the process of writing a textbook, it's very different than writing an academic book, because one of the things we're trying to do is write to an undergraduate audience, and we're trying to write engaging prose. And that's one of the things that academics often don't write in the academic books. The writing is very dense, right? And so that's one of the things we aim at doing. And one of the features, and I'll end with this, one of the features that's really important to us and that I really think students like, and I think we want to continue, is having a feature called Citizens Guide. And for each chapter, we have a Citizens Guide, which kind of gives you sort of the tools. For example, there's one Citizens Guide which asks students to look at a particular policy issue, right? And then the pros and cons of that policy issue, and then kind of a you decide kind of thing. And so we think that's pretty cool because it gives students the ability to sort of actually think about a policy and to think about their own opinions about it, right? And to give you the tools you need to critically assess that policy. Instead of telling you, here's the policy and here's how you should think about it. Rather, we'd like to say, here's the policy, here are the different opinions about it, and here's what, here are the questions that we think will lead you to making a right choice about it. Okay, so I'll stop there, and I'm happy during the Q&A. And do you want to introduce Debbie? Okay, yeah, thank you.
So please, I brought plenty of these copies of the magazine. So before you leave, be sure to take one with you. The 100 Years of Stories, Documenting a Century at the University of Houston, was a project that we began in the Center for Public History in 2020. So we've been working on it for a bit, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what is public history, what is oral history, and how have we used it in this project. But before that, I want to point out to you that we're very humble here in Houston, if you didn't know that already. And so what is our relevance here at the University of Houston to this program And I want to quote a gentleman by the name of Jesse Jones, who was often called Mr. Houston. He built some of our skyscrapers downtown in the 1920s. He owned the Houston Chronicle. He was an amazing philanthropist. We're all still benefiting from his foundation, Houston Endowment. And Jesse Jones said, looking at the map, the United States rests on Texas, and Texas rests on Houston. So it's really pointing out how important we are here along the Gulf Coast. And I would add to that that UH is also Houston's premier university, and so that is part of what makes our history also really important. So for those of you who don't know, the university was founded in 1927 as Houston Junior College. Classes were first held in the old San Jacinto High School building. And a man named E.E. Oberholzer, you probably recognize that name from our campus, was the head of the Houston School District. And some young people, just like most of you, when they were nearing the end of high school, wanted to continue going to college, but they either couldn't go out of state, they didn't have the money, they couldn't get into Rice. And so they convinced him that there was a need for higher education here in Houston for a broader audience. And so that is the beginning of the University of Houston in 1927. At the time, Houston had a population of about 400,000 people. So we were a lot smaller than what we are today. So public history is the thing that takes history out of the academy, out of academia, and brings it out to the broader public. That's a basic definition of public history. And so that could be things like the magazines that I brought today. It could be museums. It could be historical sites, documentaries. They're any one of a number of things that fall under that purview of public history. So in 2003, Joe Pratt, who was a faculty person here at the University of Houston for about 30 years, had the idea that you could actually take oral history, which is interviewing history makers, and combine that with an archives, which we have here in our library, and a magazine as a way to disseminate the information out to a broader public audience. And so the Center for Public History was the perfect spot for that. And that is exactly what happened. It became known as the Houston History Project, and it's now the Welcome Wilson Houston History Collaborative, which is a long name, I've realized. Very long acronym, too. Oral history is one of the key components of public history. It's one of the public history methodologies. And it relies extensively on memory. And we know that memory sometimes isn't always exactly correct. One person's memories may not jive with another person's memories, but that's where research comes in. And you use your research in order to corroborate and find where the facts are. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I had a student, I think he was in the first group of 5 Beta Kappa students here in the Honors College. And he interviewed Coach Bill Yeoman, who was the football coach here at U of H when they desegregated athletics. And in the course of the oral history, the student had, Bill Yeoman told the student this story about the first time they took the integrated team to a college in the Deep South and what happened, the pushback that they got and the racial slurs and all of that. He told that story about 3 times, and each time they played a different school. Now, that wasn't really accurate. They played whatever was the school, right? But that's really easy to go back and find out. You look at the schedule for 1964 and you see, okay, what was the first school they played in the Deep South, right? it doesn't matter that he didn't get the school right. What matters is the experience that he shared. And so that is what oral history is really good about doing. And it also brings in voices of people who would otherwise be marginalized and left out of the historical record altogether. So memory is at the core. It's a first-person account, so you're getting it right from the horse's mouth. And we don't just look for sound bites like maybe you would see in a journalistic interview. In oral history, you try to get a person's life story. And I don't mean you're going to get every single detail, but you're going to get a general overview of their life experiences. And then it's also recorded with the specific intent of going to an archives. And if you have a question about whether or not something qualifies as an oral history, one easy question that you can ask yourself is, does it include a dialogue between an interviewer and an interviewee? If it does not have that dialogue, it is not an oral history. Doesn't mean it's not valuable, it's just not oral history. So oral history was a key component of what we used for the 100 Years of Stories project. This was interdisciplinary. It was the Center for Public History, it was the library, it was Houston Public Media. And so the first thing we did, we assembled a group of student researchers. We chose a topic, one for each decade, that we were going to suggest to Houston Public Media for their 10 films that they were going to do. We knew our project was bigger than that. It was going to include articles in the magazine as well. The students conducted research, they conducted oral histories, they created the outlines that Houston Public Media used for their stories, and then they wrote, edited, and published the articles that we used in the magazines. And so we focused a lot on individual people's stories to understand what the contributions were to the community, to the state, to the nation, wherever, rather than just, here's the University of Houston's, administrative story. Here's what this president did, that president did. We did cover some presidents, but mostly we covered alumni. And believe it or not, a lot of institutional histories on universities do not even talk about students, which is, to me, a little bit crazy. How can you not talk about students? Students are the core of what we do. So for this, we created 80 oral histories. We did 4 magazines. So these 2 posters are covers of the magazine. The 4 that are from this project start at the top left and circle around. The one with the Pride Parade cover, that was the first magazine where we announced the project. But the other 4 are the ones that really focus on it. And we're going to have one more that's going to come out next spring in 2027, which will actually mark the centennial celebration. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a few key components to the UH story. So first of all is education and innovation. So our founding in 1927, of course, is really important. In just 7 years, by 1934, we had become a 4-year institution. And by 1963, we were a state institution. So that is part of our growth story. At the same time, we were hitting all these benchmarks. They also created a junior college for Black students, and that became a 4-year college at the same time as U of H. It became a state school in 1947, which we know today as Texas Southern. Another key point was the GI Bill, and that was the passage of the law that allowed veterans to get education benefits and housing assistance. And so my dad was one of those people in 1949. He's actually in the UH yearbook. He was taking classes in that little technology building that they're about to tear down. These are pictures from the GI Bill story. If you wander by and look at this one, you'll see all these people lined up at a table. They're registering for classes. I know you're glad you don't have to do that anymore, okay? Because we went from 2,000 students in 1944 to 10,000 students in 1946, and that's how you registered. There are pictures in the article on that of registration. So very important thing that we offered here. KUHT, many of you have probably watched Channel 8, but I bet you might not have known that it was the first educational television station, non-commercial in the country, which also makes it now the oldest. And the New York Times, by the way, didn't think educational TV was going to make it, but we did. Arte Publico Press, 1979, is founded and comes here to the University of Houston with Nick Casellas. It is the largest publisher of U.S. Latino literature and recovered items anywhere in the country. So very, very significant. And then lastly, I'm going to, on this slide, talk about President Couture. I said we didn't do a lot of administrators. We only did 3, and she's one of them. President Couture is significant because she came here in 2008 and did things that people said could not be done. I'm a Houston native. I remember when we were called Cougar High. She hates that term, by the way. And she changed things very quickly. Within 3 years, we were a Tier 1 university. That was in 2011. By 2016, we had a Phi Beta Kappa chapter. Then we got a medical school in 2019. And now we're part of the Big 12 in 2024. And maybe you'll be at the game tomorrow night because UH and Arizona are going to play for #1 in the Big 12. Okay, also, let me go to the arts. A couple of things I want to mention here. First of all, Albertus Magnus was our first outdoor piece of public art. But what's significant about public art is that UH was the first school in the state of Texas to dedicate a proportion, that's 1%, a proportion of its funding of any new building to create a work of public art or to purchase a work of public art. So we have about 300 of those here in our campus. Does anybody know where the one is for the Honors College? Ooh. Right there on the wall. It is Shine and Rise by Randy Twaddle. It was done in 2007. And you may know we have a publication, Shine and Rise. That's where it comes from. If you look at that, all the phrases are sort of backwards things, like ever and forever instead of forever and ever. So as you walk around campus, we have some 300 pieces of public art and about 700 all total in the university system. I've mentioned Shakespeare Festival also. That's something started over 50 years ago by Sidney Berger. He taught in the theater department. They do 2 productions, multiple showings of it at Miller Outdoor Theater every year. It is a gift to the community and a very important part of our culture. If you've never been to Miller Outdoor Theater, definitely you should go. All of their shows are always free, including the Shakespeare Festival. All right, civil rights and politics. I want to speak a little bit about this. Philip Hoffman was another one of the administrators that we highlighted because in 1961 is when he became president. The next year is when we desegregated our student body. And then in 1963 is when we became a public university. Also, athletics, as I mentioned, desegregated in 1964. So all of that was under his watch. as were some important things like the founding of Clear Lake, which is another one which was done in cooperation with NASA in many ways to help them out there. In 1969, the Afro-Americans for Black Liberation, which was a student-led organization, issued 10 demands to President Hoffman of things that they wanted to see change. Some of it had to do with equality of offerings in courses and scholarships and housing and that sort of thing. But one of the main things that they asked for was creation of an African American Studies department. And that was one of the demands that Hoffman really paid attention to right away. It was something that he could do internally here at U of H, and that happened. However, it did take them 50 years until their 50th anniversary to be recognized as a degree-granting institution or department by the state of Texas. They had minors, they had certificates and whatnot, but it became an undergraduate degree in 2019. Am I missing a slide? Oh, no. Oh, no, sorry. I forgot. I thought I was going for another slide. I'm just going down my bullet point list. Okay, the other one, next one I want to talk about are the three Latinas. And I'm going to show you actually a video of that one. That's why I think I was thinking it was a different slide. But Maria Jimenez graduated in '69. Yolanda Black Navarro graduated early 80s. I don't remember the exact year. And then Gracie Sines also graduated in the 1980s, and they got a law degree later. And they are all very important women to Houston politics. And so I'm going to play that in a second so that you can see two things. You can see, one, how oral history is used as part of your research. And secondly, how these films were used to tell the UH story. These others, 1989 was when Kathy Whitmire, these are all UH grads, by the way. Kathy Whitmire was elected as our first female mayor in the city of Houston. She served for 10 years. In 2010, Phyllis Fry was named by Mayor Anise Parker as the first openly transgender judge to sit on the court bench. And she got both an MBA and a law degree here. And then General Barry Price, who got a degree, master's degree from Bauer. He was part of the group in Congress who enabled women to be in combat in U.S. Armed Forces. So some pretty important things that happened as a result of the folks who graduated from the University of Houston. So we are, here at U of H, a very important building block for the city of Houston, for our history, for our government, and for the state of Texas. All of our back issues of the magazine are available for free online, so please take advantage of going to our website and take a peek at those. I'll show you the video real quick if I can. Is that okay? I'm like a minute or two over. Okay, hold on. So that gives you an idea of how we put these things together, the oral history, the research, and whatnot. And we bring it out to the public in a number of different ways, whether it's the films like this or the magazine or other things. Jason talked about why government matters. And we have that's actually sort of one of our taglines at the Center for Public History, that we make history matter in Houston. And hopefully we have done that with the 100 Years of Stories Project and some of our other work. So thank you.
Well, that's a good question. I think getting the right candidate to run, right? So the state, I think one of the issues is, and I mentioned the primaries being so important because of partisan polarization, what ends up happening is the most sort of extreme people on both sides are the ones who are making the decisions, and then that tends to produce very extreme candidates, right? And then oftentimes it leaves voters in a situation in which they're making a choice between two outcomes that they may not particularly care for. And, and of course that could be an issue depending on if someone and from the Democratic side, too far to the left would not be able to win statewide in Texas right now, right? And so I think that's the challenge for Democrats, to nominate someone who's electable statewide, right? Now, there could be a situation in which there could be a perfect storm where Republicans nominate a flawed candidate and Democrats nominate a really strong candidate. And that would probably be the situation, and in a particularly bad year for Republicans. And many people are hoping that this could be, or many Democrats are hoping that this would be the case with the Senate race with Tallarico, if he wins the nomination and Paxton wins the Republican nomination. But nevertheless, so I think Paxton still has won statewide in the last several elections, albeit narrowly, right, compared to the other Republicans. And so it may be difficult even for someone like Tallarico to defeat Paxton, right, if we're looking at sort of voters. But nevertheless, it will be a Democratic year, because those are the fundamentals. Yeah. Would be the swing bloc. Yeah, I mean, I think so. You're looking at suburban women in particular who generally vote Republican or maybe uncomfortable with voting for certain Republicans, right? And that was generally the case in the last couple presidentials as well, right? So yeah, that would be sort of the kind of the swing. And then we have to monitor the Latino vote as well, because that's one of the things that we did see a shift to Trump, right, in 2024 among Latinos, especially in the Valley, and we've highlighted that in some research. But in some recent elections, Latinos are kind of swinging back to Democrats, although it's less, I think, support for Democrats rather than discontent with the current economy, right? And so that's sort of contingent, right? We'll just have to see what happens with the Latino vote and whether those gains that Republicans made in 2024, whether they'll stick in 2026, or whether Latinos will kind of revert back to sort of a more traditional Democratic voting bloc, although not as Democratic as African Americans. Yeah, well, I mean, again, I think it will be generally when we look at the midterm elections, the party that's out of power, right, will generally gain seats. And so if we look at sort of what's happened in the past, that's probably what's going to happen now. Now, whether that sort of translates into any kind of massive sort of shift or a statewide shift, right, we'll have to see. But generally, the people who are most motivated to vote are the party opposite, a party who are not in power, right? And so that's, I think, reflected in that particular race, right? Now whether sort of in the state Senate, of course, the whole state Senate is not up for re-election. It's just a third. So we probably won't see any changes like in the state in terms of who controls the legislature, or probably any of the statewide offices. Because as Jonathan mentioned, since 1994, no Democrat has won statewide. I mean, the closest was Beto O'Rourke in the campaign. It was several years ago when he challenged Ted Cruz, right, in 2018, I believe it was. But again, I think the fundamentals the fundamentals are good for Democrats nationwide right now, right? Because of the economy and because of the uncertainty and because of just the general trends that we've seen. Whether that translates into sort of victories for Democrats in Texas statewide, I'm doubtful, right? But it could certainly happen. But I think one of the things to watch, though, is who gets nominated, right? And this is why the primaries are so important. Who gets nominated? Because a lot of these down ballot races that you just mentioned, right, like a state Senate race, could be affected and could make sort of differences in down ballot races. So whether Paxton is the Senate nominee for Republicans and whether that affects down ballot Republicans. And that's what Senator Cornyn is arguing about. Last night he was on doing a campaign event in Houston, and Cornyn was saying, we have to nominate. He wants himself to be renominated, obviously, but his argument is that his opponent, Paxton, would lead to Republican losses down ballot, right? And I think that analysis is right. I mean, I think someone like Paxton would be sort of more problematic for down ballot races. And again, campaigns can matter as well, but we seem to have all the information we need on all the major candidates, right? There's not a lot that we don't know about candidates, about these particular candidates. Right? So yeah, we'll see. I mean, there's it depends on who turns out, right? This is what we always talk about, and what the swing is, right? And we'll have to monitor that.
So turn
Ask
out.
her a question.
Turn out. Be a voter.
Yeah, and
Everybody,
voting in
be a voter.
primaries is very important, right? Because the primaries can make a huge difference.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, look, historically, I mean, if you look at Texas Republicans, like in the 90s and 2000s, you generally had kind of a pro-business sort of attitude. I think we saw the shift when Trump, of course, was nominated in 2016, and then after that. So you can kind of mark that shift, right, in the state Republican Party, I think. We talked in the book, it was funny because when we first started writing the book, many of you probably remember the Tea Party. Yeah, and so we don't really talk about Tea Party Republicans anymore, right? And we don't really talk about it in the book anymore because you don't hear that term and it's not the same, right? The Tea Party was more of kind of a reaction to Obama in 2008. Huh? Yeah, co-opted.
That became that.
Well, sure, and this is but if you look back at the Tea Party and the kind of things that they were advocating for, it was a lot more about sort of a government fiscal conservatism, right? Whereas with Trump, it did shift to a more populist kind of approach, and I think that's where the state Republican Party is now. And so that's why you see a lot of politicians like former Governor Rick Perry, right, who sort of supported things that in the past that Republicans don't support currently, right, which is things like the DREAM Act and things like that, yeah. And then immigration, policies on immigration. Recall that George W. Bush sort of proposed a comprehensive immigration reform and guest worker programs and things like that. And so that's been the big shift, I think, in the Republican Party. And it's something that I think, well, the nationalization of politics in general, right, which is happening everywhere, and of course it's happening in Texas as well.